Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. I'm Mike Baudendistel, I'm head of intermodal solutions here at FreightWaves, work primarily on the data side, joined with my colleague, as always, Joanna Marsh, who does the editorial writing for the site on the railroad industry. Good to see you, Joanna. I always see you. You always seem to be very busy and have lots of articles up on the site, and week is no exception.
Yeah, I know it's always busy in the rail industry, which is good, I guess. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, good seeing you too.
So today we have a few topics to talk about. So the Norfolk Southern derailment. I think that's sort of the thing that won't go away. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I can go through a few charts in our FreightWaves sonar product that give some early indications that the intermodal rates are declining in 2023 for domestic intermodal, at least when you back out the fuel surcharges from that. And we'll also talk about your article on Wabtec's push into potentially alternative fuel locomotives, which, I'd like to hear from you about how sort of near term or further out, those type of things are. I mean, it's always been a really popular company with investors when I was a stock analyst. And then also talk about a little bit about the latest push to get Class 1 railroads to provide additional paid sick days. You wrote an article about CSX there, and then I think you're working on an article talking about how Bernie Sanders has made this big push to get the other railroads to say, hey, why can't you be more like CSX? So we'll talk about those things, but first, here we'll start with the Norfolk Southern derailment. You have an article up on the site. There it is. There's been a lot of just really striking, pictures from this in various things. But wanted to hear from you. So what's the latest here with the derailment?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like the service updates keep changing. So for now, so Norfolk Southern released a service update today saying that the two main lines at the site, one of them is working now, and the other one they're still trying to restore service. But Norfolk Southern and a lot of state and federal investigators and officials have descended upon the site, and I believe they were able to clear out some of the trains. Some of the rail cars from that site. Actually, I believe Norfolk Southern said the other day that they were able to clear out. As of several days ago, they were able to clear out 4 of the 5 cars carrying the vinyl chloride. I'm not sure where they are in terms of the 5th car, but they are trying to move things out of the way. And in the meantime, those rail cars will be staged in another area where the National Transportation Safety Board can take a look at things and kind of get the investigation rolling.
Yeah, I mean, you would think this is going to be just a major investigation. I mean, it's a situation where, like, a lot of times when I hear about a derailment, it's like I'm sort of conditioned to not pay all that close of attention because derailments aren't not as uncommon as people think. But most derailments, it's kind of like they happen in the middle of nowhere. They spill some grain or wheat or something. It gets all cleaned up before even the local news crews can get there. This is kind of an extraordinary one that happened, looked like in a populated, area. Okay, it's a town of 5,000 people, but a lot of people were right there, had to be evacuated. It was hazardous materials. And, it seems like a lot of people are still concerned about going back to their homes. It's kind of ugly when you look at, just go to Twitter. I try to stay away from Twitter just because I think it's so distracting, but you go to Twitter and just type in Norfolk Southern and just sort of the comments there, where all of a sudden Norfolk Southern is kind of the public enemy number one, because of this derailment. And you sort of have to think back and say, well, the one that it sort of cosmetically looks like from the pictures was the Lock McGontic, but the difference is this one, no one was hurt, at least not that we know of. Maybe later on we'll hear of people that breathed in fumes or something, but that one in Canada was maybe the worst tragedy in the history of railroading. But this could have been much worse than it was. And you sort of think, well, isn't this something that some of those tank cars that are supposed to have sort of the head shields, et cetera, the thicker insulations that came a lot of these regulations came about as a result of that Lock-McGontic. It seems like this type of situation was what it was designed to prevent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I believe those NTSB actually noted that that the tank cars, did what they were supposed to do in terms of, if there is an accident, and that is something that that the Federal Railroad Administration and other railroad people, that's what they look at. What happens to tank cars, when they do get into derailments and accidents, and also how does where the tank cars are positioned on the train, how does that affect accidents as well? And Norfolk Southern, I believe on Monday afternoon, had to they sort of had to vet the other cars, and NTSB said that the tank cars, or I'm sorry, the rail cars were able to do what they were supposed to do in terms of like how they're supposed to. I can't think of the word now, but sort of vent
The kind of crash worthiness of them, yeah.
Yeah. So they were able to do it. So, yeah. So, and I know, that was something before like Lock-McGontic, just, the issue of, the tank cars being able to, withstand those accidents. And so, yeah, so it definitely could have been a lot worse, with the Lock-McGontic accident. You had, you had that the town kind of burst into flames, and you had, multiple people dying. And so, so to hear that, for the most part, I mean, time will tell, of course, but like for the most part, no one was injured. It was really kind of the best case scenario you could have if you had to have this kind of thing happen, I guess. So.
Okay, so this next question, I'm going to ask you to speculate. So what do you think might happen, if anything, as far as additional safety regulations that comes out of this type of accident?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because I think, because you have you have a faction within the rail industry. Lots of union members questioning whether headcount, not just headcount, but also just whether operations, in the drive to deploy precision scheduled railroading, whether that had sort of affected sort of safety standards, or even just like the ability to inspect things. Of like, on one hand, you do have the technology that's coming on, which is valuable, and I think the technology question is sort of a long-term one that unions and the railroads will have to sort of have to continue to have dialogue on. But on the other hand, I remember several years ago, or it wasn't maybe that was long, it might have been like a year or two ago. It seems like a long time. I wrote a piece interviewing someone who was working for one of the class ones, and it was a maintenance person, and just kind of the idea that because of PSR and because of trying to maintain that strict schedule, that affected how your timetable in terms of being able to get inspections done, like so, and being able to clear out of a inspection space before the next train comes in. So and then of course you have the other issues too with whether operations, like whether workers are given territories that are too big for them to cover, with the same amount of time, and and the that they have, so they don't really have more time to do the extra territories, so like trying to do more with less. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of what regulations will come out. I mean, I think something. I don't know. I just personally think that something will come out, but I just don't know. What was it? So it's like a year and a half to 2 months before the final report comes out. So I don't know. It might also depend like who's the president at that time. But I think as right now, there's just a lot of momentum, I believe, to look at safety regulations and are they enough?
Yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, I think that there's a big push right now on safety. I think it could hurt the railroad's case that they could have one person, crews, although one of the railroads says don't use one person crews, call them deployment into something other, the one person crews. So I think that could happen. I think maybe there could be regulations. I'm just speculating here. Have the trains run slower during, in the middle of populated areas because those chemicals, I mean, you could have the strongest tank car in the world. If it's going 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, and it comes and it hits, like those head shields are gonna cause, and it's gonna cause an explosion. So I think you could see speed derailments. And the other thing that was interesting is like what's unusual about that derailment was that it seemed like it was a mechanical failure on like one of the axles, and that's not usually the reason for derailments. Usually, the reason for derailments is that there's something the matter with the track that hasn't been maintained, but so there could be something on the mechanical side as well. But I think that's going to be interesting to see. But we'll move on. I have three other topics I want to cover today. So I'll go through this next one. Is have some intermodal charts I think are going to be interesting for this audience that are involved in rail intermodal. So let's start with this first one. So this is from a company that processes transactions, and so these are intermodal contract rates. So domestic intermodal contract rates, they're door to door, and this particular data set excludes fuel surcharges. So we're just looking at the line haul rates, and you do see in white is 2023, and that had been kind of right on top of 2022 in green up until, let's say, a week or so ago, and that sort of is broken downward, and now those rates are showing down about 3.5% year to date. Think that's going to have a steeper decline than that once more of the intermodal contracts roll over. And you do have to sort of have the context, which this chart shows nicely, that domestic intermodal contract rates up double digits percentages 2 years in a row. You see 2020 was in purple, kind of in line with 2019. You saw that step up double digits in 2021 in orange, and then 2022 in green. And this is kind of a year where I think the domestic intermodal companies give a little bit of that rate back when you exclude fuel, at least. I'm going to turn to the next one, which I think is also interesting. Sort of we have a similar chart on van. So these are dry van contract rates. And so what's different about this one is those rates are falling steeper. Sort of year to date, I just said that intermodal was down 3.5%. These are down 8% year to date. And then the other thing that was different is 2022, there was much more of a downward trajectory in the dry van contract rates starting in, let's say, the beginning of the second half, let's call it the third quarter of last year, where it felt, during the year was intermodal kind of flattened out, was kind of flat through most of last year. So situation where dry van contracts do tend to change ahead of intermodal contracts. So for intermodal, those companies out there involved in intermodal, I think you can look at dry van to sort of give a little bit of a preview of where those rates are going. I want to flip to the next one. I have the intermodal contract savings index, and this is just the difference between dry van rates and intermodal contract when you include fuel surcharges for both. You have to include fuel surcharges for both because the fuel savings associated with intermodal is a big part of that savings that the shipper sees when using intermodal. And the white line shows for all lengths of haul, and we limit this data series to the same 5-digit origin and destination pairings. And so in a lot of cases, it's shippers that use intermodal and dry van in the same lanes, actually from the same facilities, depending on whether something's time sensitive or not. Right now, it's showing 9.8% discount at intermodal versus dry van. That's kind of at the low end of the range. You think of the typical range as being sort of 10 to 15%, and that green line is simply the limiting it to the longer haul lanes, those that are 1,200 miles or longer. So those would be your LA to Dallas, LA to Chicago, those type of lanes where there is typically a larger spread associated with those lanes. And so you put those things together and say, well, would expect intermodal contract rates to fall, make that spread a little bit wider to get to the normal part of the range. So it's just another data set that suggests to me that shippers can negotiate intermodal contracts to be lower in addition to dry van contracts. So with that, I want to move on to the next topic, which is another article that you wrote. It has to do with Wabtec. You interviewed an executive at Wabtec. There it is. U.S. needs to invest in hydrogen rail technology. This is a company that there's always a lot of interest in. I think when I was a stock analyst, I think I got more calls on Wabtec than any of the other companies that I covered. But what did you uncover from interviewing Wabtec?
Yeah, it was pretty neat. So it was actually initially supposed to be part of. The story was initially going to be about the partnership between Wabtec and the two national laboratories, Oak Ridge and Argonne. But then the Wabtec VP, Philip, I'm blanking on his last name, I'm sorry, but you can read it in the article. He had just some interesting ideas about just hydrogen technology in general. So that's kind of how it ended up being a two-parter series. So of course, you have that partnership be with the national laboratories, which you can also read about in another article. But what's interesting about the Wabtec, I think, several things. I mean, one was just the idea that you have transportation modes kind of collaborating on technology that's to power. How can you use hydrogen to power to power motor vehicles or to power vehicles? And so you have that Wabtec partnership with General Motors, and then kind of related to that too. I mean, if you're going to be using hydrogen more, what sort of obviously production is going to have to grow, and the infrastructure to carry that hydrogen is also going to have to have that partnership with BNSF or BNSF's involvement with a group with the Midwest, which includes Bakken Energy, and in terms of trying to get that hydrogen infrastructure. So I thought, I guess that was one thing I was interesting. Looking at hydrogen in general is just kind of, it's not just one company trying to do everything. It's just, because there's just so much to tackle. And so, and there's a lot of expertise from various modes and other stakeholders in this. So yeah, so that's one of the things. And there's some other things too. I think the idea of, he mentioned sort of, is there a way, and this is kind of more of like future forward thinking. So, it's still sort of abstract, but like, is there a way to use, so if the locomotives can carry electricity because they have that capability, can they actually carry electricity using the rail network? So, can you use, I mean, which I thought was kind of a neat way of looking at things in terms of, are there other uses beyond the rail network, just, beyond just what's been doing now? Like, can you transport electricity on it? And of course, you've had that discussion about like electrification of the railroads, but can you still transport that electricity without having to use the catenaries? Of course, that's also about locomotives and moving whatever. But so that was another thing. Oh, and the other thing I think was interesting was just the push for all this research is because that it's not just the United States going for these technologies. You have countries around the world that have been actually doing this kind of research for a while, and the United States is just starting to sort of catch up on this thing. So you have that race as well in terms of transportation related technologies, but also just hydrogen infrastructure in general. So there was a lot to unpack in there.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of, is it going to come first to the yard locomotives? Is it easier to implement in yard locomotives just because you don't have to carry that fuel with you and worry about having the fuel all along the way and have something like a tender car?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I don't think they didn't really specify it. I mean, it would make sense to look at it in that. I mean, I think that's kind of where they're lots of where the industry green efforts are, looking at, yard operations and just seeing, what can be done now. So, and then building upon that experience and knowledge to sort of transfer that onto the network.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and want to move on to now the piece I think you're working on now is there's this letter from Bernie Sanders to the railroad CEOs, with the exception of CSX. He left the CSX out of it, and basically said, CSX made this new thing to give workers paid leave, and sort of the specifics there is it's two unions, Brotherhood of Maintenance and Way employees, Brotherhood of Railway and Carmen. Together, they only represent about 5,000 workers. So it's certainly not most of the workers on that railroad, but so they get four paid sick days on an annual basis at 100% rate of their rate of pay. Ability to take up to 3 additional paid sick days on an annual basis provides the option for employees to contribute those unpaid sick days to either a 401k or get a payout and get paid for those unused sick days. And he writes this piece to the other Class 1 CEOs, essentially saying, well, why can't you do the same thing? This would only be 1% of your profits. What do you make of this political football, and thoughts on whether the other railroads are going to follow CSX's lead?
Yeah. It is interesting how well this week has been kind of interesting in terms of the sick leave issue, because you have the CSX announcement, for starters, in terms of the two unions, and then of course you have the union leaders urging for that to adopt it more widely with among the other class ones. But then you also have, which I'm trying to I'm working on the story right now. You also have just other discussion about it, like as you mentioned that the Bernie Sanders letter. He actually held a press conference earlier today. About the letter, but also just about sick leave in general. And actually, several of the union leaders spoke at that as well. And with the idea that this week is the 30th anniversary of the Family Medical Leave Act, and so that's kind of how they're framing things right now, and trying to get the sick leave discussion back out there. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of whether they'll get bipartisan support, and what kind of bipartisan support they'll get if that does happen. Because so Bernie Sanders' involvement in this issue is kind of related to what happened in December with the collective bargaining agreements, and some maneuvering in Congress in terms of seeing whether sick leave can be sort of introduced in a bill or something, as part of the a way to get the agreements moving forward. And it was interesting. I think in the Senate it was the Senate. There were some interesting Republican. I would say interesting Republicans, but like it was interesting because everyone's interesting. Because I believe Mark Rubio signed onto that. Calling for sick leave for railroad workers, and just people that just people that you might not necessarily expect to be on that. So it'll be interesting, like I said, just to see which Republicans come out in support of that, and who they are, because at the Sanders press conference there was a Republican senator who was also there, and I have to I'm unprepared. Live TV. I have to figure, but I'll be writing that up fairly shortly, so you can catch it more.
Well, great. Well, we'll be sure to read that article. And everyone wants to be the champion of the working class, depending. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. With the last 20 seconds, just want to mention who we're going to have on the next couple of weeks. Next week, we'll be talking to Herman Hackstein. He's the president of the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association, works on behalf of shippers. And on March 2nd, we're going to have Dan Elliott, the former chairman of the U.S. Surface Transportation Board, now serves as an attorney working on behalf of railroad shippers. So be sure to tune into those things, and hope everyone has a great day.